to the XYChromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Good to see you, Pierce. Doing great.
Awesome. Yeah, well, today we're going to be talking about addiction again, another part of our addiction series, the Polyvagal Theory and how it ties in. But first, let's cover some good news. In a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news, we felt it would be nice to start off each show covering a good news story and sharing our thoughts. So, what do you have for us today, Richard?
I have a little piece on carbon capture. So some scientists and researchers at the National University of Singapore have developed a novel technique that significantly advances the conversion of waste carbon dioxide into value-added chemicals and fuels. Now, I'm not going to get too into the tall weeds with this. I think just the headline is pretty good news right there.
Yeah.
What they have figured out is that, so in industrial production of chemicals and reagents and other types of materials that are used in industry, carbon dioxide is a feedstock. And so in order to use this carbon dioxide as the feedstock to create these polymers and adhesives and so forth, they need purified carbon dioxide gas. That means that there has to be an industrial process for converting some other hydrocarbon into CO2. If you've read the news, you know that CO2 is becoming very abundant in our atmosphere, which is going to be a problem climatically. And so wouldn't it be nice if we weren't generating more CO2 for industry, but using the CO2 that already comes out of flue gas? There's just one tiny problem. Flue gas CO2 is pretty dirty stuff. It's compromised by all these other materials that arrive in flue gas as well, and these are nitric oxides and sulfur dioxides and so forth. So this Singapore, National University of Singapore research, what it does is they've come up with a catalyst and electrolyte solution that when you put good old-fashioned dirty flue gas through it, you still are able to synthesize and capture carbon dioxide from that flue gas.
And so it's purified, or it's of the quality that is needed for the chemical processing?
Totally. So part of the expense to capturing flue gas and using it for secondary and tertiary industrial chemicals is that it has to be cleaned and purified, adding cost. So what this does is it reduces that cleaning and purification process cost to zero, and then we're able to capture, let's say, flue gas coming off of a power plant or some other type of application. Maybe it's some other type of refinery or some other thing that produces this flue gas.
Yeah.
So what's neat about this is the image that they supply with the news story on carboncapturemagazine.com is it actually looks like the fuel cell fixture that we use in the lab to learn how hydrogen fuel cells work.
Yeah.
So kind of a neat thing where they've built this fixture. It's a demonstration model, and then when they put basically dirty flue gas over it, they still get their nice, clean, synthesized CO2 for industry. Pretty big deal if we can come up with ways to not only redirect, not only capture, but then essentially reissue captured carbon into other product types. Then we're not really struggling with the life cycle problem of burying it back in the ground again, which is usually how people think of carbon capture. But instead of it being a waste product, this has been the evolution of industries ever since the Industrial Revolution. Can we transform a waste stream into a product stream or an input stream?
Yeah.
And it looks like these researchers have done that. The next stage to this, like all other academic breakthroughs, is scale. They're going to have to figure out how to upscale the size of the what I call it, the reaction plate, or let me look at this news story again to make sure I have the right terminology here. So the part of the the way that this type of thing works is that you have this material substrate, and in this case, it's going to be nickel on copper. And when that is exposed to an electrolytic or an acidic substance, then that becomes really attractive to carbon dioxide. So it's a catalyst. That's the term I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so they're going to have to figure out how to scale this up into a larger industrialized size, and then all the other features and challenges that are associated with that.
So
But good
this,
news.
yeah, it is really good news. I'm reminded. So one of one of my clients that I've been advising has been working in the methane capture industry, and so they've been looking at
Mm-hmm.
various methane capture solutions and pairing them with other technologies. And one of these really cool, and so modular. If you can throw modular in with some type of energy solution, it's super
Yeah.
attractive to the market, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
more one-stop shop it is, the more attractive it becomes, right? And so now it's not, do you have a modular methane capture solution? Is there's units out there in different companies that are processing the methane and producing like a purified methane that could be used right away on site for what you need.
Yeah.
Um, and it breaks down all the nitrates or nitrogens that are in in all of the byproducts that come from methane capture. Um, and so that seems to be a lot of the way things are going for landfills and kind of wastewater methane capture solutions. Like, hey, can we put a module on it and produce 25 kilowatts of power off of this thing? And so it just sounds like once again, it's kind of a tertiary reason for capturing carbon, for chemical plant processing, but still, nonetheless, it seems like the industry is going for smart capture. Can you
Yeah.
synthesize? Can you process it? And can you scale it up? The one of the a couple, I'm not going to name any of the companies because we're not sponsoring any of them, but a couple of the cool things with the modular methane capture is you could basically, just like Legos or anything else, you just hook them up on each other in series, for as long as you needed them to go. Really versatile in how you could use them, stack them, and things like that. So for those, the scalability was right there in the way that they packaged them. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
this carbon capture, the study will lead hopefully eventually to somebody who wants to take a bite at making it profitable. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyways,
And this is also this is a separate news story entirely, but this fits kind of in that matrix of different types of technologies and technological ideas. Like I recently heard something about turning coffee into biochar. So coffee grounds, it turns out Homo sapiens really love our coffee, and we throw away millions of tons of coffee grounds every year after squeezing the last little bits of juice out of them. And you can't just put coffee into concrete and have it work. That's a utter failure. It weakens concrete.
I've
But if you
read
turn
something
coffee,
about this article, by the way. I just now that
yeah,
now that you're saying concrete, I'm like, okay, I know you. I was like, something about what he's saying sounds familiar. Anyways, continue. My
totally.
bad.
And but you can turn it into biochar by heating it up to whatever it is, 600 degrees centigrade in low oxygen environments, and then that biochar can go into concrete. The reason this is interesting from a environmental perspective is because one, coffee biochar offsets the amount of sand that you need to have in the concrete mixture, because cement is this really complex matrix of different types of earth substances that maybe we'll talk about in a different show. But
I wrote
you
a
when you,
25-page material science paper on
you
concrete, so
totally,
I
you
I
sure
have
did.
I have some things to say about concrete as well. By the way, for all the users out there, the listeners out there listening, concrete is going through a revolution recently, and it's pretty
Yeah.
exciting. Like a lot of things in the industry, and a lot of scientists have looked into the past for answers going forward about how we should
Hmm.
create concrete in the future. So we should leave that for some episode in the future because I'd like to get into that. But yeah, continue.
So by diverting the coffee waste into a input for concrete, we do two things. We reduce the amount of potential methane that the decomposing coffee grounds creates in the landfills, and we offset the amount of sand that goes into the concrete mixture. And doing both of these things changes and reduces the amount of total carbon produced by the production of concrete. So there's these great synergies where we can figure out how to take a waste stream from one industry and then merge it as an input stream into another industry. And the CO2 catalyst makes me think of that.
Yes. And if you're looking for something to do with your coffee grounds and you happen to have rhododendra and non-acidic ground where your rhododendra are, it is good to put coffee grounds around in the soil around there to add to the acidity for your acidic-based plants. If you happen to be in a very clayey area like where my house in Portland was, there was clay in the ground, you need to put coffee grounds in it. So
Mhm.
just a fun little planting factoid for all those rhododendron owners. I see beautiful ones in Portland all the time, so shout out to Portland for that.
uh,
Uh,
yes, audience, you can follow Pierce for more gardening tips.
please no. I can only keep plants alive outside of the house. When they come into the house, all of a sudden, I don't know what happens, but yeah, my wife's way better at the indoor planting than I am. So, all right, well, let's today we're going to talk about addiction again. Yeah, so fun, jolly stuff. And Richard, it sounded like we wanted to get into the polyvagal theory. Was kind of the setup last time, and how this works into what we've been talking about in terms of addiction. I think a quick recap is essentially the first episode of addiction. We laid out my theory of addiction ships, along with
Mhm.
a bunch of authors that Richard had read that thought would be pertinent to our addiction conversation, so that when we were citing them, you guys, the listeners out there, would have at least an idea of the material that was being referenced. And then the second part of addiction, our fourth episode, we talked about cancer, and it was a good news story that was talking about the origins and kind of like looking beyond the superficial effects of cancer and causes of
Mhm.
cancer and looking into the deeper traumatic based, addiction based born types of reasons for cancer, and then that process. And then we related over that. And then the episode we haven't released yet, that will be getting released tomorrow morning, will be episode 5, one behind this one right here, where I read an excerpt from my book, and then
Mhm.
we talk about that, my addiction. And so now we are here. There's my recap. How'd I do? Did I miss anything?
Pretty good. We're all up to speed, and I'm so glad that we're interlacing in these episodes so that their order. People will listen to these out of order for sure, but this way it ensures that they will.
Like, wait a second, yeah, then it'll be going, wait, do I have to go back to the front? Okay, yeah, exactly. So,
All right, so let me give a quick introduction to what the polyvagal theory is. The polyvagal theory was created and developed by Stephen Porges in the mid 1990s. I think he published the polyvagal theory in 1994. And the theory describes the physiological and psychological states which underlie our daily behavior, as well as challenges related to our wellness and mental health. So the we're going to talk about something that exists as a theory, and that's because in scientific parlance, a theory means that we have not been able to perform enough scientific measurements and tests on enough test subjects to confirm it as a scientific law. But the theory actually works really well for understanding how our neurobiology works. And so even though it is not a hard and fast law in the annals of science, it's actually working really well in the realm of social work and trauma treatment. Go ahead,
it,
Pierce.
well, and I think Sean Carroll explained this pretty well at some point. I'm going to butcher how he explained it, but there's a lot of theories out there that are
Mm-hmm.
essentially laws. They're only
Mm-hmm.
theories on the periphery. And
Yeah.
like when we're looking like the general theory of relativity, Einstein's general theory of relativity.
Mhm.
That science, that physics has been tested more than his has been tested a lot. It's been tested a lot
Mhm.
over and over again, and it always almost always strikes true. There were always mathematical inconsistencies at the periphery of that theory. Now, I
Yeah.
don't have the physical background, the physics background to even get into explaining those inconsistencies. Um, but I do read news articles about really smart people solving parts of those inconsistencies every year, which is really cool. Um, so he would, I'm pretty sure he mentioned, a lot of theories, they aren't laws, but a lot of it is laws. They're only theories on the periphery. A small portion of it is still evolving science and stuff. And so a lot of theories can be looked at that. And so that's why theories can be so annoying, right? Like when we say the theory of
Yeah.
evolution, well, a lot of that is known science. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about with the evolution of our brains stems from the theory of evolution. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
known science we get from that theory, but it's still evolving as things do, unironically. And
Yeah.
so I thought that was important to mention the nuance of theory, the word theory. It's a very loaded term.
There will always be. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson referred to it as the bleeding edge of science. So there'll always be the the part of scientific inquiry and investigation where um, there are no absolutes. Nothing is confirmed. We're testing hypotheses and we're collecting data and then performing analysis on that data. And the tests need to be replicated by other disinterested or hostile parties. In fact, scientific theory can become law faster if people who are basically hostile to the original research check it out, because then we know that there's no biases coming from the researcher, that they actually would like to see it fail so they could discredit their competitors.
Yeah, some of the best theories have been confirmed by some hater that was rigorously trying to
Yeah,
disprove it, and then frustrated, finally yield to, in defeat to the soundness, I guess, of the theory put forth by the
yeah.
opposing scientists. Oh,
And then
yes.
there's, as you described it, sort of settled um, not settled law, but settled scientific understanding that is at the center of that area of research and study, where what we're doing is um, using everything that we know so far and everywhere that that theory maps onto, that we can use it as a model for testing an expectation. And
Yeah.
that's largely what polyvagal is it's a theory, and its application in trauma treatment is being used as a model. And models are just ways for us to predict an outcome and then run the scenario through that model. And if the outcome matches what we predicted, then it's a pretty useful model, and we'll go with it, even though it's not settled science. So I'm going to I have some slides I'm going to be reading from so that I can make sure that things that I'm saying are not completely just my flawed memory. I'm listening to Polyvagal World by Stephen Porges and his son Seth Porges. It's a book that they recently published, and um, I a lot of these ideas go into my brain, and they have to be reinforced by several listenings of the audiobook before they're really something I can speak extemporaneously about. So
I
I've gone to the Polyvagal Institute page, and I've captured some text here. Go ahead, Pierce.
I thought that's so interesting that both Porges and Mate both have written books with their sons now.
Yeah.
It actually makes a lot of sense if they've really dove into the idea of trauma and explored these issues, that they would have to explore their own trauma and the trauma that they probably inflicted on their sons, right? And this cathartic experience of kind of figuring out, like, hey, is it my fault or is it your fault? So that's really that's quite interesting. I didn't know uh, Porges had written a book with his son as well, but I knew Gabor Mate had,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
and they talk about this often. So really interesting. Hmm.
And then for the audience, if you're interested in delving deeper into these topics that we talk about here, there's a podcast called Being Well, which you're going to love this, Pierce, is hosted by Forrest Hansen, and his regular returning guest is Rick Hansen, his dad. And so I think what's also interesting here, and maybe I'm projecting onto you, it's alien to you and I to think about doing anything with our dads because of their unbelievable colossal failures in our lives. So we see somebody else doing it, we're like, wow, that's amazing.
It's so funny too because I know our dads were pretty different, but
Yeah,
I mean, my dad would have been like, "I'm doing you a favor if you're doing anything with me," right? At the end of the
yeah,
day, that's how it would have been because he was such a narcissist. At the end of the day,
yeah,
it's like, "Oh, oh, you want to do something with me? Well, I guess I can inconvenience myself to do something with my son." I mean, that was the
yeah,
way it was when he'd come over to see our kid. I was like, "Hey, do you want to come see your grandkid?" It was always like, I'm doing you a favor to drive 30 minutes across town, to
yeah.
see us. It's like, okay, man, so yeah. Uh, and then your dad, I can't speak to him, but I don't think he would have been the same way, but he equally wouldn't have wanted to do anything with you and vice versa. So,
I, yeah, I think we have many more shows to get into, and maybe this topic can be brought back up again. But
the
I'll just
dad
mention
series.
briefly. I grew up in a family where both of the adults were incandescently talented people, which meant that if you're not at their level of talent, you're basically worthless. And so that is this unbelievable amount of work I've had to do, which is to overcome this idea that I'm a vessel with no value in this world. And that's a consequence of being around these. I've equated to this like, imagine being Michael Jordan's kid and not being able to do the leaps that Michael Jordan could do to put a ball in a hoop. And that was essentially the same type of thing. And and there was just never going to be any ratification of my accomplishments or existential value from those people. And so that's part of the other reason why it's like, do a project with your dad and write a book? Huh.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, God, our parents definitely were opposite because they were all superficial and
Mm-hmm.
and like they love to brag about how talented I was to the public, but then like
Mm-hmm.
literally got zero acknowledgement in my home life. I
Yeah.
was just eager for other people to be around because then I knew my dad would be like, "Yeah, my son's really smart and like he's great at all this stuff."
Yeah.
And then I'd be like, "Oh, cool," and then I get, home and it's like, can I go to the advanced math class? Can I go to community college and high school instead and take classes up? No, no, none of that. That's too far of a drive, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Too
yeah,
much
so
effort.
too much effort. Like I'm doing you a favor, Pierce. I'm doing you a favor, working on you getting better education, God. I thought you were going to be a contractor for my business, for my construction company the whole time. That's what I was
Yeah.
I needed another worker. So, uh, geez. All
Well,
right.
at least the women can find us valuable for our labor, right?
That's right. Farm boy, as my wife likes to say. No, I'm just joking around. Uh,
Let's get back to this polyvagal theory before it gets too cathartic on this one episode.
we'll talk about dads later. I'm sure we'll have a dad episode series. It will be really fun. For us and cathartic for
Yeah.
us. We will be able to bitch about them and they won't be able to do anything about it, which is pretty cool. So,
Well, polyvagal theory emphasizes the role of the autonomic nervous system, especially the vagus nerve, and the role that it plays in regulating our health and behavior. So, um, when you start getting into these theories of our biology and neurobiology, one of the first things you realize is that if you didn't recently take a biology class in college, it starts to get out of hand quick with the terminology. And all autonomous or autonomic nervous system means is that it's the part of our nervous system that goes on working without our conscious uh, intervention. So that is to say, As long as you see me here talking, that means my heart is pumping, and I can't do a darn thing about it. It's just going to keep pumping. And that's also to say that there are other aspects of my biology and my nervous system that I basically ignore. Like, don't know about you, Pierce, but I'm wearing some shoes. And this whole time we've been talking, I haven't been thinking about those shoes, them making contact with my feet this whole time,
Well, damn
until
it, you
now that
started
I
making
mentioned it.
me pay attention to it now. No.
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
So now all I'm going to think about is my shoes and that weird tag that's in my shirt. So the autonomic nervous system is a part of the vagus nerve, and the first thing that we get into with talking about this anatomy is that the vagus nerve has, in our species, a ventral, which is front, and a dorsal, which is back. And those two different splits in the vagus nerve as it comes out of our brainstem and goes down the spine and into the thoracic cavity, those actually are, according to the theory, those play a role in very specific nervous system functions that we can control, or that we have access to with intentional thought.
So
So I'll get
let
into
me
that in a little bit.
Oh, I was gonna say, just for the viewers' understanding, to make sure I'm tracking, this would be something more like we create habits and systems so that we can actually put it into subconscious control, essentially, like the idea of like um, consciously making habits that you just naturally, like when you're driving, there's, there's some subconscious thought happening when you're on the phone and you're driving and all these things are happening. You're kind of just driving, you're paying attention to the road, hopefully, but I would wonder if that might be kind of what we're talking about here as far as being able to consciously put something in your subconscious as far as like an autonomous action.
Slightly different topic, but what you describe is actually a really important idea in the way that our brains conserve energy by filtering.
Okay. All right.
And
Anyways.
what's interesting about your question, though, is that I'll give you an example of the application of the vagus nerve. For example, in the act of driving. So what the vagus nerve is doing is it's providing information from the body back up to the brain, and that's about 80% of its traffic. And then about 20% of its traffic is from the brain back down into the body. And what's going on constantly is the brain is sampling. So this is the cranial nerve. The vagus is the cranial nerve. What it's doing is it's going in and connecting into our brain in the magical way that nerves socket into the central nervous system. I'm not going to get into that in this discussion. And it's delivering sensations to the brain so the brain can make predictions about what's about to happen. So our mood and behavior and anything that we're about to do intentionally, or maybe less intentionally and more instinctively, is created by these body sensations. That is to say that our bodies are just as receptive to external stimuli as you would think. That what's happening is we're just taking in information from our eyes and our nose, and that's all that it is. Well, those are also connected up to the vagus. And the sensations that our bodies are experiencing tell our brain a lot about the potential of hazard or safety that we're in right now. When I'm driving, for example, I'm, well, thankfully, elevated into what we can call a yellow zone of sympathetic nervous system state, which is to say, I'm alert, I'm ready to respond to some type of crisis, and I'm essentially in a heightened mode of threat neuroception. I expect other drivers around me to do something pretty antisocial and dangerous at any moment, and I have to react to it. Which is ideally where our nervous system would be set while we're driving. There's only one tiny problem with my nervous system, which is it's also unable to distinguish what's happening around me while I'm driving and what happened to me in the past.
Hmm.
And so anytime I enter into that yellow zone of threat neuroception where I'm poised and ready, what I'm also doing is activating the historic experience of threat and danger and suffering that I had gone through that had never been, the loop had never been closed on. My nervous system had at some point in the past, many times, gone into this state of being prepared to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and then that thing didn't work. That survival behavior didn't work. And I still experienced terror to the point of expecting death, still lived through it, but was never brought back into a green state where my body could um, sense safety. The signals of safety never outnumber the signals of threat or hazard or danger.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the central features of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is in our minds, if we have this disorder, well, if we have this system of symptoms, what's actually happening is a characteristic of us being unable to distinguish what's happening in the now, in the present, from what happened to us in the past. And so what polyvagal theory does is it describes the biology of our peripheral nervous system and what's happening with that and how that translates into what are essentially character disorders and mental illness, or that's the way that our modern medical system would describe them. What's actually happening is perfectly adaptable and very useful impulsive behaviors, instinctive behaviors. They're just being applied at times that don't make sense, that don't fit the situation. So,
I was going to say, so it sounds like what happens is due to the trauma,
mhm,
the the sensors have been damaged for how either that are gathering the information or the way that the polyvagal system is processing that information, it's misinterpreting it somehow because
bingo.
um, it's basically it's getting all this feedback and it's like, oh, this feedback means this because it never because in the past it always meant this and there was never a time for it to downregulate basically or
Mhm,
allow downregulation on your end or there was no calming, soothing downregulation feedback from your surroundings, which is where that would have
right.
came, right? Like when your mom, you're upset, something happened, your mom soothes with a soothing voice. Oh, what's wrong, Richard? All the things that you need to hear to downregulate during your,
Yeah.
first 4 years of development and on and on and on. Same with your dad not using the right tones and
Yep.
comforting you when you were either hurt, all the normal things that kids do when they go off and they touch sharp things, they fall, they bump their head, they run to their parents, they get that what down regulation because you're not allowed you don't kids don't even have the ability to down regulate half the time on their own. Like
No.
you have you like the feedback from the parents is there to help them down regulate. And since you don't get that, you never have that happen naturally. Your brain, I feel like the polyvagal is just like, hey, this means this, and that's the way I'm going to interpret it until
Hmm.
I'm told otherwise. Even if I'm told otherwise, like So, anyways, my understanding basically
Yeah.
this
Not only are
process.
you not only are you sounding like you're understanding it, you're actually doing a great job of preparing me to go on and talk more about this co-regulation piece. Because it turns out that in our species, you're absolutely right. Before the age of 25, you're working with a underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. That's the central nervous system, it's the front of the brain, central nervous system. And what that does, what our species uses that part of the brain for, is to mediate external nervous systems. So it's how we make judgments about the situation so we can say, oh, what you're feeling right now, if you're feeling like this is a threatening environment, let me demonstrate for you how it's not. And
Yeah.
then using that in my own internal self-control, for example, I can then create what I think is a useful terminology, a shared language of safety.
Mm.
Because I can't just look at somebody, grab them by the shoulders and say, "You're safe, goddammit, stop it." That doesn't work. What I can do is change the tone of my voice. So voice intonation makes a big difference. Sometimes physical contact makes all the difference in helping someone regulate their sense of threat, their threat
Or sometimes
neuroception.
it has the opposite effect, depending on the
Exactly. Those
person. So that's a
paradoxes.
that's a tricky one there. Voice
Yep.
typically always, if you're going to go soft voice, you're going
Yep.
to have a better chance. But touching,
Yeah.
yeah, a
And
shoulder touch you might think is good, but you never know. Like with that one, So
so there's paradoxes ahead. So you're absolutely right. Touch sometimes gives you the opposite effect. But generally speaking, the shape of the face will also help another person co-regulate. So what's interesting about our faces is that there's, you can divide it into top and lower. And um, what we can learn about this is that the lower part of the face, if a person focuses on just the mouth, it sends more signals of threat than it does of safety. Whereas the top part of the face sends more signals of safety than it does of threat, even though both parts of the face have the utility of communicating both things.
yeah,
So prefrontal cortex is used by the adults who have the ideally mature brain that they can use to mediate other nervous systems, in particular those of people with underdeveloped central nervous systems, i.e. your kids. So I'm going to start moving through some of these slides here. By applying polyvagal theory to our personal lives as well as to disciplines such as medicine, education, and management, we can understand how safety, co-regulation, and connection are paramount to healthy human experience. All right, so I'm going to click around here and make sure I've got some of my principles here. All right, so we're going to get into the autonomic nervous system, and we're going to talk a little bit about that evolution that we brought up earlier as that theory of how we got here, but it works really well for describing what we know anatomically about ourselves and what we know
right.
anatomically about other vertebrates.
I'm gonna check
The process,
the chicken while you talk. I'm gonna be off screen, everybody, but I'm listening and I'm there. And don't worry, I'll be back in 3 minutes while you kick us off with the slide reading. I know what you're doing right now. So
checking his chicken is not a pejorative or some euphemism. He's literally cooking chicken for his family. Through the process of evolution, the mammalian ANS, the autonomic nervous system, has a primary repertoire of three principal states. These states functionally and adaptively shift according to how safe we feel at any given moment. The mechanism involved in shifting these states, so neuroception is involved in this way of shifting these states, occurs beneath the level of consciousness and awareness. These states form an underlying neurophysiological foundation for our feelings and emotions. In reality, these states are not always independent, but may interact to form hybrid states, which support a continuum of behavior and ranging from quiescence to mobilized actions within both safe and threatening contexts. So these three principal states are the green zone, so rest and recovery. In the green zone, our digestive system is online and working, and it's doing its process of converting organic matter that we've consumed into useful nutritional parts. In that green zone, we're the most ready to be vulnerable and interactive with other Homo sapiens or other appropriate mammals, for example, that have sophisticated enough nervous systems that we can connect with them. Dogs are a good example of this type of other type of mammal that we can co-regulate with. And it's probably no surprise that it just happened that wolves had just the right sophistication of their nervous systems that combined with domestication, we get this other creature that's not a Homo sapien at all, but has unbelievable ability to understand us. Well, we shaped that that creature. And that's what dogs are. And so when we talk about these three principal states, we have green, we have the yellow. I talked about that already. So we're mobilized and we're ready to defend ourselves or in some other way put into use a survival strategy,
Mm-hmm.
fight, flight, or maybe even uh, I use the term fawn, but to use negotiating techniques for
Yeah.
survival. And then the third state,
Reasoning, that like reasoning might be
there you go.
the least of the limbic system, like maybe the more evolved part of all of those things, which would be reasoning. That seems like a little bit of the prefrontal cortex might be in there if you're trying to negotiate somehow,
So, so the fawning strategy, which is one that I'm very familiar with, it's what I would call my typology for how I interact with the world. It's a sort of it's connect under duress kind of idea, and what it means, what we can determine from that, and I would say I'm a sample of one here. What we can determine from people whose default survival strategy is fawning is that they had to manage dangerous adults while they were children. They lack the central nervous system sophistication to do much of anything else. So what they tried to do throughout their developmental life was keep the mood and temper of adults below the threshold of violence. And that would describe the 17 years I spent living in the house that I grew up in. When I went into the military, it turned out that it was still a highly effective way to interact with people. Because, of course, these are all, we can point to a not insignificant number of people that we interacted with when we were in active duty who were at the breaking point of sociopathy and antisocial behavior all the time.
all
And
the time.
so these
I was in
people
the Q course
also,
for 2 years, and as an
yes,
18 X-ray, and I know this doesn't mean a lot to very many people, but anyone who went through the 18 X-ray program and was in the Q course for too long, you understood how many of the instructors that were there were like, they were like working on their third DUI, working on their third divorce, working on their,
yep,
I mean, geez, these guys were, they loved to be at the job to torture us. Like it was
yeah,
like this is the first time only time I ever you get smoked overnight was in the Q course. You get like literally like, oh, you've been smoked for 24 hours. By the way, anybody who doesn't know what smoking is the haven't I've explained this? No, I've
you
already
have.
explained smoking. No, I'll explain it one more time. We could have new users. Smoking is when you get destroyed physically because somebody else fucked up, somebody in a different unit fucked, who knows? You're getting punished because even somebody had a bad day and they want to inflict a bad day on you.
Mm-hmm.
When you're physically tired and burnt out, you are smoked. That's what getting smoked is. It's like doing push-ups beyond your capacity to do push-ups, doing lunges beyond your capacity to do it, doing burpees beyond you're never out of your capacity to do burpees, but they do start to look a lot like wormies. So, anyways, I
All right,
digress.
so I've talked about the green zone, the yellow zone, and now the red zone. And so the red zone is this is where we would see the deployment of the freeze response, and it's where the sympathetic nervous system is basically shut down. The autonomic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system is really taken over, and it's the most primitive of our survival strategies. It's virtually indistinguishable from what reptiles do. And so a reptile under threat really only has a couple of useful means of survival, and one of them is to completely freeze. And so this is that most primitive version of our survival strategies. Sometimes the only way to not be, you know, consumed by a predator, and our species lived through so our species has been around for 300,000 years, but our progenitors lived through this for millions of years, and that's where we get our nervous systems from.
Yeah.
And freezing might actually be the ticket out of a dangerous situation. Well, what it means is that a different nervous system strategy has gone into play. And in the red zone, when an organism such as ourselves feels like there's no other possible way out of this, we can't run, we'll be captured. We can't fight the thing, it's too big and scary.
It'll fight
And
harder if we do. Well, it'll hurt
yeah,
more. That's the
totally.
threat. You can fight. You just know you're gonna hurt more. That's why the fight
Yep.
gets out.
And it can't be reasoned with. I can't deploy my fawning technique and talk it out of being dangerous. Well, it turns out that there are these really interesting implications for that red zone parasympathetic nervous system engagement. And one of them has to do with in trauma survivors who went through some of the most horrendous treatment by caregivers and by people that could overpower them. That is what their default safety strategy is. And so what you get are these really upsetting situations where people are sexually assaulted later on in life when they totally could have fought off their attacker, or that whoever they were having this encounter with thought that they were totally going along with it. They thought it was consensual. And it's because at some point in their life, their nervous system flipped the bit so that they just go default right into this freeze state,
Yeah,
and
just
anything can happen to them from that point. And they're dissociated. They might not even have narrative memory of what happens to them anytime that this takes place. So I'm going to take a moment here and say, I'm also very familiar with this freeze state. This dissociative freeze state is something that I noticed was happening to me when I was performing in adjudicated events while dancing. So I would go to this ball that we were having at the studio, and the place is packed. It's really noisy. There's all this commotion. But all I had to do was go down on the floor and, dance the rumba or dance the foxtrot. And I would come back off the floor. I had been dancing with an instructor that I knew really well, and I was comfortable enough with the situation, even though it's not my venue to be in a really noisy place.
hmm
But I would come off the floor, and people would be, you know, commenting on what I had done in a positive light. Hey, you look great out there. And I would say to them, I just don't have a narrative memory of what just happened. And so this freeze response can take place even while we're dancing the
yeah.
foxtrot, but it robs us of a narrative memory of what happened while we were doing it. So there's our three levels: green, yellow, red. And when we talk about this repertoire of three principal states, that's what we're discussing. And what I would like to introduce here before I move on is this idea that those can be used in combination. So when we're resting and digesting and connecting with our friends and we're safe, the parasympathetic nervous system is also engaged. That's just one of the piano keys that our nervous system can play tones with to make a chord. So my analogy here is you can also think of the polyvagal theory in this way, that our nervous system is playing an instrument that has three possible key combinations to play these chords. And if we play the chords one way, we have an abundance of signals of safety. If we play the chords another way, we have more signals of hazard than safety. And if we play the chords a third way, we get total nervous system shutdown or deactivation or disassociation. So wanted
In
to kind of get these ideas here.
in this analogy, is
Mm-hmm.
the polyvagal is that system the conductor or the musician? And is the prefrontal cortex still the conductor, or has he been put to the side by the musician who stands up and he's like, no, I'm conducting now? Like, I'm just
What a
curious
great
about.
question. Yeah, what a great question for my analogy. Maybe I hadn't really thought it through very much. In the symphony of our total functioning nervous system, the conductor is the brain. Just the brain
The whole brain
as a central nervous system entity.
as a CPU.
Now, Now, we always get, all these analogies always break down at some point, but one way that we can think about our nervous system is that there's like 5 brains. Now, this gets super complicated because how could you just say that the central nervous system is one thing? Now you're saying it's 5.
Octopus has 8, don't they? I
Well,
keep hearing that they have 8 brains. So,
it turns out the way that our nervous system is, the way that it came to exist wasn't by the design of an engineer. It came to exist through the tinkering of evolution. And so the things that even at the level of sophistication that we are now, we still have a heritage that comes from the simplest forms of life. And the simplest forms of life would have organized their early nervous systems around their digestive system. So it turns out the cluster of nerves that you can find in our GI tract, or associated with our GI tract, are it is biomass sufficiently large enough to be the size of a cat's brain, and it's sophisticated enough to handle the goings on of the GI tract, which is non-trivial for sure.
it's
And it's
one of the most
also
complex systems of the body.
totally.
The digestive system, when I was failing through special operation combat medic course and the Q course,
Mhm.
failing terribly through the anatomy and physiology section, the digestive system was the biggest book out of all of the systems.
Yeah.
You would think the brain, no, the nervous system, the heart, that's easy to memorize all that stuff. The digestive system, that thing was a monster. Now, I've forgotten most of everything about all of that, but I do remember the digestive system being a total beast. When you find out how much it's responsible for, it's no surprise that it's probably one of our most ancient and most overdeveloped things about us as a creature. Yeah. So
A side note here, as someone who has lived with complex trauma my entire life, and who's see our last episode, disease state of cancer affected. I've never had a totally like happy GI tract. And what we now understand is that when we're perpetually in a state of alert or alarm or threat neuroception, yellow, what that's constantly doing is telling our GI tract to alternate between these different states of kind of shutting down to prepare for danger, or maybe it slips back into action for a little while, but it's always being it's if you want to make someone crazy, put them in a double bind, give them a no-win situation. The other way that you can make us really angry is move the goalpost constantly. Well, that has always been the case for my GI tract. It's never had a really nice, stable 24-hour period where it could just do its job without being interrupted constantly by me getting into a car and then being pissed off for 30 minutes.
yeah.
So I digressed into this idea that actually there's essentially the biomass of about 5 different brains kind of all working together at the same time in our biology.
Hmm.
And so I mentioned the GI tract, the cluster of nerves that's in our abdomen. But then when you look at the way that our central nervous system is structured, well, there's 2 halves of it, and those 2 halves have their own structures within them, and that's how you get the 5 different brains.
Yeah.
That said, so when you want to think about the analogy of the way that I used the chords that you could play with piano keys as a way to think about the 3 different states of our nervous system.
And that's with
What you're
the vagus system is managing those 3 chords or playing those
Yeah,
3 cards at this point, right? Yeah.
and you can think of that as being both the piano and the piano player at the same time. They're
Okay.
kind
Yeah.
of one unit when they're performing, right?
Yeah.
And um, just imagine, if you will, if the audience has anyone in it that's played instruments before or knows about how instruments are played. When you combine these different elements of your instrument, like the keys on a piano, not the keys on a piano.
Yeah.
I think it's a different thing entirely. When you think about those keys, you can play single keys at a time and get lovely tones, but really the greatest sophisticated sounds that can come from that instrument come from the chords. And that's the idea that I would like us to work with, is that you could use your left hand to play these different chords on the piano while your right hand plays these individual
The
keys.
tune. Yeah.
And there you go. You get the combined song. Now, why do I love analogies like musical instruments in the human body? Because of tone and vibration and oscillators. And that's all a piano is just a really clever way to combine a bunch of oscillators together to make sounds that our ears like to hear.
Yeah. They're tight.
So,
They have tight strings. Those strings are taut, and then when you pull
bingo.
them, they oscillate, and it
Yep.
creates a vibration and frequency that our ears find either pleasing, or if it's a bad pianist, then not pleasing.
Right. Yeah, me. If I'm clang, clang, clang. Okay. I learned to play the piano when I was in 8th grade, and I haven't touched it since. So that's my analogy is at least obsolete, if not totally
I've
wrong.
always tinkled. I've always tinkled on the piano, but I've never really played too much. But yes.
All right, so let's get back into these. The regulation of the autonomic nervous system involves a built-in surveillance system involving higher brain structures that dynamically and continuously interpret the information regarding risk. And those risks interpretations are being transmitted via sensors throughout the body. From this matrix of sensory information, our nervous system is constantly discerning risk without involving the thinking parts of the brain. That's the
Mm,
ENS.
yeah.
It's going on. When we think about this analogy of a symphony of people playing instruments, yeah, it's almost like the conductor's having a conversation on the side, and everyone's just playing.
Yeah, so I completely agree. What it always felt like to me when I was listening to Stephen Porges, and what I was trying to get to before I really knew about the polyvagal system, and I was kind of looking at the amygdala, I was looking at limbic system, all parts of
Mm-hmm.
this system, obviously the brain, all parts of the system, but all parts that kind of dealt with this fight or flight mechanism, and then the idea of auto making your life autonomous from your brain, your decision making part of your brain. And everything that I've been writing to this point is kind of made me overall realize that slowly over time, my brain found a way to get through my upbringing. And the
Yep.
way it did was it engaged my polyvagal system and my limbic system because I was in this heightened fear state from poverty and from the dad that was, dependent on who you got. Someone you couldn't please, but you could
Yeah.
please, but you never knew. It was always changing. The rules were changing. He'd be really nice and lovely, and you really wanted him to love and care about everything I was doing. And if he did, it felt great. And if he didn't, it felt like I was being, attacked. Um, but as I have been writing about this, what I've realized is I found these modes of escapism. I found these
Mm-hmm.
tricks to cope and to
Mm-hmm.
adjust my life so it didn't feel like total shit going through the childhood. And I feel like almost my brain subconsciously rationalizes like, hey, what your polyvagal system, all this autonomous, it's working for you. It's working for you. We can keep doing this. Your body, we're going to suppress your vagal system. It's going to suppress the inputs from your physical duress. All that shit, we can suppress that. Over time, don't worry. We'll be able to fucking clamp down the pain or the discomfort you should be feeling in your gut or your diet or any of the things that make you
Yep.
uncomfortable. We can fucking crush that. And you'll feel, pain when you're in basic training and all those things. When I was in the Q course, I felt the pain of being smoked and all that shit, but I wasn't feeling the weight and the deadening sensation of my trauma from my past. And my polyvagal system was just slowly putting things into the auto. Hey, your brain doesn't need to reason through this. And I felt like that is kind of what I did until I met Sarah and started to kind of dig myself out of this autonomous brain. Even with her, my vagal system or this congregation of musicians were really playing the tune. They were taking over the
Mm-hmm.
tune. They had taken over the reins for the composer. And even after I'd met
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, I was still going headfirst into all these addictions or essentially destructive tendencies. The
Yeah.
problem is none of these parts of your brain are the parts, your prefrontal cortex, the part that's supposed to think to the future, think ahead, reason 4 steps ahead, the part that's going to play chess and win chess for you. You know,
Hmm.
none of them were that. And so what they're thinking they're doing, because my sensors are all messed up, I'm not absorbing
Hmm.
the information properly, or I'm not interpreting it right, it's killing me. It's killing people slowly over time. And
Hmm.
I feel like with veterans, more than anything, I see people, and I saw it in myself, performing some form of suicide. And it's just the
Yep.
timeline of what you want to do. It's like, well, I'm gonna live. Mine was, I'm gonna escape reality to my disreality because it's fun there,
Hmm.
until I slowly die from this because I can cope with this life, you know. And
Yep.
you know people who could live to 50, 60, 70 doing that kind of suicide, even older. Like, it's a
Yeah.
slow ass fucking suicide. And then you see the people who, like, along that way, it breaks them and they decide to fucking kill themselves, or they kill themselves, they get cancers, that whatever, you know, like
Hmm.
it's just, it is a route to destruction. That, like, at the
Yes.
end of the day, it ends up being a route to destruction. What saved you as a child, what protected you from your trauma, and like you and I discussed in the last couple of episodes, it worked. It did work,
Hmm.
but these aren't long-term solutions. And I think a lot of what we talk about is the fact that that it isn't long-term, and you have to kind of undo that if you want to live a semi-healthy normal life, I suppose. Is that kind of, I mean, that's kind of where I'm getting with this polyvagal kind of missing key, as far as this subconscious, like mind virus. Like, it's almost like a mind virus slowly taking over parts of your brain that they think that it can autonomize or something. So I don't know.
There's a lot there's so much to unpack there. What I think I'll do is maybe comment a little bit here, and then I'll talk more about this, because as you're hearing this, you're getting jargon and technical terminologies that kind of, they need to fit someplace into your understanding of the paradigm of how our bodies work.
Yeah.
And that's good, because that means you have a foundation to start with. When I first heard about these things, I didn't really. Every time I learned a new piece, it sounded like it was some contradiction to the last thing that I learned. And then ultimately, what it comes together as, when I use these analogies like our nervous system and our biology is a symphony, or our nervous system and our biology is a many faceted gemstone. Every time you turn it over, you get a different look at it. And you can always characterize these things as um, interrelated and interconnected, and that no single look at it is the picture, is the entire picture. It's always just a single look at one very specific part. And the ultimate understanding that we're trying to achieve is the systems understanding, the interrelated understanding. Um, a
So
digression here.
I think I understand what you're saying. So it's funny because I've always been the kind, I've always kind of been the person who, I feel like I can, with not very much knowledge, piece together overall
Yeah.
a theory about a system. And then what I do is I go, okay, well, now let me see if evidence is pro to this theory, my overall
Yeah.
idea of how the system works, or if it generally, if I'm off, right? And that's fine. And so when I started writing about this, I had talked to you a couple times. I had a
Hmm.
very minimal biological understanding, or even the nomenclature still is, you know, foreign to me when we're talking about a lot of these biological systems. But I kind of was like, oh, this is the piece of evidence that supports my theory that I'm kind of coming to, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is, like, I keep you know, it's a open theory. I'm dynamic on it. I'm not really set in stone. I'm like, well, I kind of have this general idea, I guess. So it's not even a theory. It's like, it's a general idea, and we'll let it see if it becomes a theory. And as you've presented more evidence,
Hmm.
as you've given me reading material and videos to watch, a lot of it just goes, okay, yep, I'm on the right track, or oh,
Yeah.
this was the part I was missing. And, like, even when you were reviewing my writing, you were like, eh, you're getting some of this backwards. And I knew it was because I was missing pieces to the puzzle, but I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm sure after our polyvagal discussions, I'll have more to kind of piece in here and right the wrongs of my understanding of how these systems work. But I hope this isn't me bragging about my ability to look at systems, but it feels a little braggy. But that is to say,
Well,
yeah, anyways.
what you're describing is your technique for finding a model, interpreting its utility to you, then testing that model. And as I said at the beginning, polyvagal theory is a model that we can use and we can test. We can say, okay, I see behavior. Here's a behavior. I was going to use a letter to describe it, but I don't want to do that yet. Here's a behavior, and the behavior has these problems associated with it. What caused it? What caused the behavior? That's called the ABCs of behavior: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So the behavior model of Homo sapiens turned out to be really limited, but it's a pretty decent model for kind of studying the surface of what we're doing. What polyvagal theory is a much more sophisticated model that when we look at the outcomes or outputs of behavior, we actually can go past the antecedents or open the antecedents up into this much more colorful and richly toned environment that tells us a lot more about what would generate a behavior. So you're just the right audience for this discussion, Pierce, because you put together these models, you test them, you see what their utility is to you, and then you figure out the different pieces. So good on you. And let's move on, shall we?
Yes. So I think we have to actually, we're at the hour marker right now. And
Are
so we're
we?
going to have to, yes, we are. And this has been a really fun episode, actually. I've really enjoyed myself, I have to say. I, I've enjoyed myself every time, but this has been
Yeah.
fun. I feel like it's really interesting subject material. I know you have these slides, but I like going into them and seeing, kind of our theories um, play out as we go through that. I hope you haven't minded the breakups on the slides or anything like that.
It's the best way to go through them. They'd be boring otherwise.
All right, good. Well, so everybody who's listening, we're gonna have to cut this episode in half and pick right back up where we stopped. Just for reference, where are you at between the three slides? Let's leave a marker to pick up off on.
All right, so I was halfway through, and the next slide is number 5 out of a series of 8. So we're perfect. We're
Perfect.
halfway.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm gonna call you right back, Richard, and it was really fun talking to you today.
Likewise. Talk to you later, Pierce.
All right. Take care.